Hello everybody, welcome back to Kenny's channel of all things collectible. Today's video is a rather poignant and in some ways sad one for me because I'll explain. When I'm thinking about doing videos, I normally think, 2 or 3 ahead. What subject am I gonna talk about and show? One of the things I had planned for, maybe 1 or 2 down the line was my collection of books and magazines and various other paraphernalia by the American author Harlan Ellison. Now, sadly, the great man died last week, aged 84. And so I thought I would push that forward and use this video as a tribute to and a celebration of his work, which was extensive and quite excellent. Let me give you a quick skeleton biography of the man. I'm guessing that a lot of you maybe never heard of him. I'm guessing that many of you have never come across his work, at least, because strangely his books have not really been in print that often in this country. He is very well known in America because of he's been an activist. He's also been a TV scriptwriter for many shows, many of which have only showed in America. Some stuff that we haven't seen over here, and also he's basically a short story writer. So he's got many books in print, but just not that many of them over here. He was, back in the 70s, 80s, the darling of the chat shows because of his forthright views on various subjects and his articulate forthright views also. And the fact that we don't know him as well as the Americans is purely an accident of exposure, I suppose. Nevertheless, he was born in Cleveland, Ohio, 1934. He was born to a Jewish family. He himself, as a young lad, was quite short. Still was actually. I think he was around about 5'4", which people mercilessly ribbed him about, apparently. But when he was a kid, he was bullied because he was Jewish and short, basically. And that experience, I suppose, led to his personality in later life. He was a pugnacious character, controversial figure, fiercely argumentative at times, he just called on those experiences, I guess, in his writing as well. But when in later life, he had joined the army, where he learned a lot. He had some very weird jobs, some of which were, one of which was driving a dynamite truck, of all things. He ran with some street gangs in his teens, I believe it was his teens. And those experiences with the street gangs led to his first earlier writings, which were basically novels about the street gangs and his experiences there. He didn't write many novels in his career. He was a short story writer. Eventually he became attached to science fiction via his interest in local fandom and conventions, and he started his own group, and he then started to write science fiction fantasy stories. He didn't like being called particularly a sci-fi writer. He preferred to have his work known as speculative fiction, but I think at heart he was a fantasist, much in the mould of Ray Bradbury, who's perhaps a bit better known on these shores. He was once quoted, as famously quoted, as saying, "If you call me a sci-fi writer, I'll come round and nail your pet's head to the table." that was the kind of stuff he would come out with, and as I say, he became a very honoured speculative fiction writer. He won numerous awards in the science fiction field, even though he was a speculative fiction writer. The Hugo, which is a very prestigious award, the Nebulas, he won them multiple times, and he won all sorts of honours. Horror, you name it, you name the genre, he was honoured for it. And as I say, he wrote prodigiously until the mid-80s when his output stopped somewhat, but more recently he became more active again, and although he was in his 80s or late 70s, he was still publishing stuff. His mind was still as sharp as ever, even though he'd had heart attacks and more recently a stroke. That's where he is. Now I've got a fairly extensive collection of stuff by him. Compared to the people who professionally collect his stuff, shall we say. My collection's pretty sparse. I don't have a lot of the first editions, that people who collect his works have sought over the years. A lot of them worth a lot of money now. I don't have those, but I do have a fairish collection. He apart from writing for writing short stories, he also dabbled in comic books. I can show you one here. There's one that he had a hand in writing. Daredevil. He also famously did a Hulk and an Avengers story, which I think were tied in. And then he had other comic books published. Chocolate Alphabet. One of his more famous stories, Boy and His Dog, was published, drawn by Richard Corbin, who's one of the great underground artists, or was, till he became more mainstream, and that was the second edition. So his work has been varied. As I say, he was a very prodigious screenwriter. He famously wrote the City on the Edge of Forever segment of the original Star Trek series, but it was so badly butchered that it was almost unrecognisable. I mean, I've got the original screenplay, and it's tremendous. Compared, I mean, the episode that was aired was quite good compared with the rest of the stuff, but his original screenplay for it was really outstanding. But he wrote a lot of stuff that appeared in the old pulp magazines. This sort of stuff. I mean, this is a 1965 edition, and in this particular magazine, Galaxy, he doesn't get a cover credit, but inside is one of his most famous stories. Repent, Harlequin, said the TikTok man, which you can see halfway on the page there. That's the story that most people know him for anyway, although he has written a lot of other classics as well. Find someone to put those, and over the years, I mean, he's written for various pulp magazines. In case anybody's not familiar with the way writers' finances work, what happens is science fiction writer, you know, back in the day would write a story, send it to a magazine, and if it was accepted, they would get paid for first publication in the pulp magazine, and then when they'd done a few stories for the pulps, they would then become collected and hopefully published in hardback, which would give them more finance. And then when the hardback had been out for so long, it would then go to a first paperback printing, and then, you know, they would get more royalties, etc., etc. And then, you know, if the stuff was successful, successive reprints would give. So, you know, they would earn money on a rolling on basis, as long as they were good writers and successful, which Harlan Ellison was. There's another one there. I mean, that's another one of his, The Beast That Shouted Love at the Heart of the World. That's another one of his very famous stories that won one of the prestigious awards. I'll just run through these very quickly for you, just to give you a taste of these old magazines. There's a story, Rock God, he wrote for Coven 13, which I assume is some sort of a horror pulp. And actually, this was Rock God was actually adapted for one of the Warren magazines. I think either Creepy, or I think it was Creepy or Eerie. It might have been. I can't remember. And it was famously illustrated by Neil Adams, who was one of the more famous comic book artists that any of you that are into comics will know quite well. On some of these, that's a special award, Hugo Awards issue. There'll be a story inside by Harlan Ellison. But on some of these, there's no cover credit. This was quite unusual for Harlan Ellison because he didn't write hard science fiction stories very often, and Analog magazine was well known as a magazine for hard science fiction stories. I mean, not so much when this was written in the 70s, but in its earlier days, it was very sort of like hardcore science fiction. And as I say, Harlan didn't write a lot of that kind of stuff, but he managed to get himself into a couple of issues of Analog. And then we have amazing stories, you know, these great titles. Some of these pulp magazines, amazing, and there's one coming up, fantastic. You know, they were just cheap ways to put stories over to people. You know, they started off. Anybody else will have seen my Shadow pulp segment that I did a couple of months ago. Will not remember me saying that these were just a cheap, you know, form. The paper was rubbish, and they were just cheap thrills, basically. We got there, Dogfight on 101. Right, I'll just run through these very quickly. So some issues you just got your name on, other issues actually told you what the story was. Yeah, a nice cover there. Haunt of Horror, great title. The Haunt of Horror, so his name just appears on the cover there. It doesn't tell you what the actual story is. Fantastic, Pain God. there was actually a anthology, paper anthology called Pain God as well. So that's obviously made it into there, and then fantastic. Doesn't actually get a cover credit on that one, but there is a story of his inside there. But the main magazine that seemed to publish his stories was the magazine of fantasy and science fiction. As I say, he was more regarded as a fantasist than a science fiction writer. So they tended to pick up his stories more than the actual science fiction mags. The thing about these pulp magazines is that they had some great covers. That was by Harlan Wilson, who was pretty famous in this country as an illustrator. It's worth showing you these just for the covers. Although having said that, that one's a bit boring, but by and large, they're pretty good. As you can see, he was quite prolific in the magazine of fantasy and science fiction. And all of this culminated later on, which I'll show you in an issue devoted to Harlan Ellison, all on his own, Deathbird. I mean, that's a lovely cover, and that's one of my favourite stories. It has a segment in the story we've woven into the story that describes when he had to take his pet dog to be put down because he was sick. And honestly, it brought me to tears. It's the only novel I've read that's actually reduced me to tears. But it's very, very, very powerful story, that one. Makes me teary-eyed just thinking about it. There's another one with no credit, but he does have a story in there, believe me. Otherwise I wouldn't have it. That's one of the anniversary issues. Just a couple more to go now. Croatoan, and that's another quite famous story of his. That's a bit more boring. It's another anniversary issue with one of his stories. Another one there, and then in this one he gets a story, all to the cover stories all his, and there's an image of the great man himself. And then, as I say, this all culminated in the Harlan Ellison issue. Yeah, right. So there's a taste of the pulp magazines. Now, as I said, in his early days, he ran with his street gang, and this was one of the. This is a very early novel. This will be the 50s. Great, kick when he's down, aim for the groin, stomp, will be stumped. It's not really indicative of the quality of his later work, but nevertheless, everybody has to start somewhere. These were interesting. I used to have a large collection of these, but I had to get rid of stuff over the years. It's what they used to call the ace doubles. So you've got two complete novels, one on the back, one on the front, and both of these, unusually, the two novels used to be primarily by different authors, but unusually this has both of those stories are by Harlan Ellison. Once again, it's a very early example of his work, and then Rockabilly. That was another novel about some sort of rock star. It's one of the few works of his I've not read, but I will get round to it, I can assure you. This was another early double issue. As I say, some of this stuff's not really indicative of the quality of his later work, but and these were the collection start of all the works that have appeared in various pulp magazines. These covers, a lot of these covers are by a husband and wife team called Leo and Diane Dillon. They did a lot of his, especially his hardback works, first editions, and they do some lovely paintings. That's not a great example because you can only see a little bit of it, but right, over the edge. There's a picture of Harlan in his younger days. He had a reputation as a bit of a hellraiser. A lot of people get this reputation, but there are many famous stories of him of excessive behaviour. But I don't know whether you believe all of them or not. But there's one famous incident that could never have happened. That is always told about Harlan, and that's he shoved a rude fan down an escalator shaft. As Harlan pointed out, if he had done that, the guy would be dead. So, you can forget that one. I have no mouth and I must scream. That's another award-winning story of his. I should point out all of these paperbacks are American, but as I say, we hardly ever got anything in print over here. Approaching Oblivion. That's a Leo and Diane Dillon cover. That's a better example because you can see it better. Beast That Shouted Love. I showed you that story in one of the pulp magazines. There it is, collected with a bunch of others. Some of these collections do duplicate stories, but of course I suppose it's difficult to put out collections of all news stories unless you're really churning them out. If you want to make some money, you've got to keep churning books out if you can, or keep bringing books out of stuff that you've written. Alice in Wonderland, that was originally the name of I don't know, it might still be. It became known as something else later on, which is too complex to remember. But that was the name of his house, which stores lots of art treasures, paintings. You name it, it's there. And he's like me. He's obviously a serial collector, and that's the story that I mentioned to you earlier that made me cry. That's the collection that it appeared in. Again, a nice cover by the Dillons, and we have. I'll tell you a rather amusing story about that one. I had to re-buy that. I mean, I bought it when it first came out, and I was back in the days when we had a bathtub. Going back to the late 70s, probably early 80s. Here, I was reading that in the bath, and I dropped it in the flaming bath. I was most upset. It wasn't until fairly recently that I actually bought it back again, because I'd forgotten that I dropped it in the bath and that I needed another copy. But good old eBay came to my rescue. Right, here's actually an English edition of a hardback that I'll show you later. So some work did make it to these shores. That was something that was written to be a TV series. Again, it's one of the very few Ellison books that I've not read, so I can't say too much about that one. That was another English. That's an anthology of all different writers. You know, Harlan Ellison happens to have a story in there. I should. Where the heck is it? I thought that one was signed. I was just about to point out to you actually that a lot of these books are actually signed by Harlan Ellison. I got them signed, strangely enough, even though he lives in America and I live here. But I've got a story that I will tell you a bit later, and tell you the reason why all of my books are signed. Again, that's another anthology of works by different authors in which he happens to appear. Keep these so I can get them back. Right, there we are. That's the one I was talking to you about earlier, City on the Edge of Forever. 6 science fiction plays. That's got the original screenplay, original script. And if you're a Star Trek fan and you've seen that episode, that is well worth a read if you can find it. And that's quite an old edition now, as well as being a writer of short stories. Harlan Ellison was also an editor, and a very good one at that. And this is the famous Dangerous Visions. I guess he became involved with what they called the New Wave. There were a lot of British authors writing speculative fiction that was slightly different to what had come before. It was called the New Wave. Some of its exponents were Michael Moorcock, who you've probably heard of, J.G. Ballard, Thomas Dish, Brian Aldiss, people of that stature and ilk, and this was an anthology of stories that could not have been published at an earlier time. They were of their time, and basically it was they just asked authors. Harlan Ellison asked authors to submit stories that were completely free of any constraints, for want of a better way to put it. And those stories all appeared in this. The authors would just let off the leash and said, "Look, just write what you want. Sex, rock and roll, drugs, anything you want to write a story about. Just write it and submit it." And the best ones appeared in here. That's a remarkable book. That one. If you ever have the opportunity to buy that and you like a bit of speculative fiction, then that's what you need. And that spawned obviously a sequel again, Dangerous Visions. That was part 1, because everybody was throwing stories at him from left, right, and centre by the time this came out. So it needed a rather large volume, or in this case, split into 2. There was to be a 3rd volume, but for various reasons that never appeared. It's still a bone of contention with a lot of people who actually excuse me, who actually submitted stories for it, but that's another story which I haven't got time to go into here. This was an interesting one. I'll just take it out of its constraints here. Yeah, this was... this was written by Harlan to appear in this rather odd format, actually. You know, it's a weird shape, but it's illustrated by Frank Miller, who a lot of you will know from the comic books. It's a very hard-edged story, that one, and it's quite rare these days. I think you can get a limited edition. This is just a trade edition. You can get a limited edition of it, which is quite rare at least. Yeah, that's an interesting one to have. And then just got a few more to show you here. There's I think that one's yeah, that's a collection. Then we have one of the last paperbacks I bought when I was a sort of an acolyte, if you like, of Harlan Ellison's. I mean, his stories, I just found them amazing. You know, I've always had a slightly skewed view of the world compared with other people, and when I read Harlan Ellison's stories, I thought to myself, God, here's someone else who actually thinks the way I do. And you know, I read voraciously. I got all of his stuff and read it. And this was one of the last books that I bought before he sort of went into hibernation as far as writing was concerned. And that was sad for me because, you know, I just wanted to read more and more, and there was nothing forthcoming after that one. That was, I don't know when that came out, that must have been mid-80s, yeah, May 84 that was published. So yeah, that was a sad time for me because there was no more new Harlan Ellison stuff to come. But this little series is one of my favourites. It's a series that Pyramid Books did in America. I think it was a series of 9 that was actually an essay on TV, The Glass Teat. Very amusing it is as well. And then some of his other collections were published. Some which hadn't been actually published before. That was a series of stories that he wrote with other authors in partnership with, co-authored in other words. That was number 4. And then The Other Glass Teat, that was the second series of essays about TV. Spider Kiss, that was one of his earlier novels revisited, and Gentleman Junkie. Deadly Streets. So a lot of these were earlier works. Doors, No Windows. So they were very welcome to me because they introduced me to the City. They introduced me to a lot of the work that I hadn't read previously because they just weren't available to me. And great title, that Love Ain't Nothing But Sex Misspelled. Great stuff, man. So yeah, that's my little collection of paperbacks. I have a few larger size. That was a book about Ellison, anecdotes from other authors. It's not one of my favourite books, to be honest. That's Watching. That's a series of, I think it's magazine or newspaper columns he did about TV reviews and such. It's an interesting read. Gives you an idea of American TV. Angry Candy. That was, yeah. Well, that was when as I say, I mentioned that he stopped writing for a while. This was I don't know when this was published. Yeah, this was the back end of the 80s, so you know, getting on towards the 90s when some stuff started filtering through again, and I became happier. And then this little volume is great. It's just a retrospective 35-year collection of all of his fine stories. It's a mammoth volume. I think there's been another one since this, and I haven't actually picked that one up, but I think it's all of those stories in there, plus a few more later stories. I can't remember whether that's a 35-year. I can't remember what the other one was, maybe 40, 45, I don't know. Yeah, so there's, I showed you an English publication of his stories in Saturday. That's the hardback version of it. So you won't find many hardbacks with Ellison stories in this country, but that's one of the few. That's Ellison Wonderland, which I showed you the paperback of. These were all published by Millington Press, which is going to lead me to now show you a couple of things which will prompt an anecdote, a personal anecdote from me. That's Approaching Oblivion. That's another Millington edition. Right, anecdote time. These two books are particularly special to me. That's again Dangerous Visions, the second anthology he edited, and that's The Beast That Shouted Love at the Heart of the World. Now, when those two books came out, Harlan Ellison came to England. This was August 1976. He came and he promoted these in Charing Cross Road, London, at a bookstore called Words of Music, if I remember rightly. And one thing he was famous for in America, when he did all these promos in America, was he would actually sit in a shop window, whatever shop he was promoting his books at. He would either sit in the window, or if he didn't have a window, he could sit in somewhere, within the shop, and he would write a short story per day. With no preparation, nothing already written down. He would just sit and write a short story. And when he came to England in August 76, that's exactly what he did. He spent 3 days there, and he wrote a short story a day. Now, I lived in London at the time, and of course I couldn't let that opportunity slip by. So I went to London in the hope of meeting him. Now, it's funny how fate works these little things out for you. This was pure happenstance, but on the way, I visited a local market near where I lived that sold books, paperback books, and I was rifling through all of the trays of books. There was hundreds of them, and I happened to come across two of Harlan Ellison's 1957, I think it was, paperbacks. They were actually had an English sticker on them, or not a sticker, but they were overprinted some way, with I forget what it was, 1 9 or 2 shillings or something like this. This was pre-decimalisation. And I picked these two books up, they're great, a couple of Harlan Ellison books, and off I trotted. And when I got there, I'd heard all these stories of him being very rude to rude people, rude fans, and I'd heard this story about the elevator shaft. I'd heard other stories about him physically attacking people who had been rude to him. You never know the truth of these things. They all come to you secondhand, these stories. And to be quite honest, I was a bit apprehensive about even sort of like approaching him, because I knew A, he'd be busy with his stories, and B, whether he would welcome any approaches from overzealous fans. But when I got there, he was yelling at some bloke in the shop to change the music. He didn't care for what music they were playing, and he wanted something from Shakespeare or something, Midsummer Night's Dream. So have you got that? Can you put that on the music, or whatever they called it at the time? I thought, he's not in a very good mood. But anyway, eventually the opportunity arose to go and talk to him, because I went and paid for the books, and I took them over to be signed. And I sort of very politely said, as you usually do, hello Harlan, big fan. And I showed him the two books that I'd bought on the way in, and his eyes lit up. And he said, I don't think my bibliographer's got these. He was quite excited about them. I said, okay, Harlan. I said, if your bibliographer hasn't got them, take them as a gift. Please have them. And he was absolutely, ecstatic about this, which kind of, ingratiated me straight away. So I got into conversation with him, because there weren't many people about, and it turned out that I'd intended to start a fanzine. I did a lot of fanzine work back in the day with comics. I intended to start the Harlan Ellison Appreciation Society, and I had written a piece for a local fanzine, which I gave him to have a look at cheekily. And I mentioned this to him, and he seemed interested. He said, a girl in America wanted to do that, but she wanted sort of locks of hair and all that nonsense. I said, no. I said, this is nothing like that. I said, this is about your writing. And we got chatting, and I'd taken a tape recorder with me, and I said, look, Harlan, would you mind, if we had a little chat and I recorded it, and then I can transcribe it for the fans? And he said, no trouble. I mean, all this amongst a guy wanting to get a story written. So, it was very, very, very kind of him, I thought. And then he said, I'm really delighted that you've given me these two books. Is there anything? I wish there was something I could do in return. I said, there is actually, Harlan. I said, see this case? I carrying a little suitcase with me. I said, it's full of your books. I said, would you mind signing them for me? He said, yeah, no problem. So he sat down, and we sat down for about 20 minutes just chatting about his work while he signed every book that I possessed, of his. And then he sort of opened the fanzine that I gave him, and I've actually got a copy of it here somewhere. That was it. It was a local comic fanzine, and in there was this little article I did, and whoever had done the sub-editing or the editing decided it would be a good idea to put Ellison Ken Howes likes him. Well, my second name's Howes with an H, and he thought this was amusing, so he signed that for me, for Ken, for me. And then when I took the books out for him to sign, I got that one for Ken. He missed the S off. A lot of people do that. For Ken Howe, with gratitude. And then the other one, which will always be a treasure to me, is with thanks and best wishes from Harlan Ellison to the Ken Howe Appreciation Society. So I mean, of all the books that I possess, that if the book police came tomorrow and said to me, taking all your books away, you can keep one, that'll be the one, because that one means a lot to me. It brings back a lot of happy memories also. And while I'm on about this, Time Out magazine, which is quite a famous magazine in London, they actually I'll find it. I should have maybe prepared. Oh, there we are. They actually did a piece on Harlan. There he is with his typewriter, typing a story, and he did 3 of those over the 3 days. I went to see him again on the 2nd day. I didn't bother on the 3rd because he's probably sick of the sight of me by then. But this was another strange thing that happened. I mean, this day lives long in my memory because of all the happenstance. But apparently, if you bought one of the books, you would get a signed copy of that day's story the next day. So you would buy one of the hardbacks, take it to Harlan for sign, and they'd take a note of who you were, and then you go back the next day, and you would actually get a signed copy of the manuscript that gets sent to whichever magazine he was sending it to. And weirdly enough, it had Harlan's address and his phone number on, which obviously he would put on the manuscript. And I know Harlan was fiercely he wouldn't want his privacy invaded later on, so he would never get something like that later on in his life. But yeah, and this particular one was working with the little people, which appeared, I believe it appeared in that fantasy and science fiction Harlan Ellison issue only. And then the next day, again, all of these Emissary from Hamlin. I can't remember where that story appeared. And then the last one was greatly titled The Diagnosis of Dr. Dark Angel. Great stuff. So yeah, so you ended up with 3 manuscripts as well. So yeah, that was the day I met Harlan Ellison, and long may it live in my memory. Okay, so we'll just finish off here with, that was another collection that came out in the late 80s, Slippage. I don't have many hardbacks, sadly. And then I'm going to go from last to first here. This was a series of books that were published by, I believe it was White Wolf Publishers. They were called Edgeworks, and the plan was there'd be 20 of them, and they would more or less reprint all of Harlan Ellison's works to date. Sadly, only 4 of them got done. There was some problem along the line, and Harlan backed out of it, I think. But basically, you had two collections in one volume there. They were very nice, actually, very nice books. It's a shame they didn't get finished, because they'd have made a very handsome set, and I'd have bought them all. That was the number 3, Harlan Ellison Hornbook, tricky to say, and Harlan Ellison's movie. Neither of those I'd seen in print before, so I was absolutely delighted to have those. And there's a couple that I've already showed you in paperback, Spider Kiss and Stalking the Nightmare. Nice cover, that. And the first one was Over the Edge, which I've shown you the paperback for, An Edge in My Voice. I don't think I'd had that one prior to that one either, so that was good. So yeah, so that's basically my collection of his works. I do have various other bits of paraphernalia here, which are in that was American he used to write a lot of letters. You know, people used to write in and say, "Oh, Harlan Ellison, don't like him," or "I didn't like that story," and he would reply, you know, in no uncertain terms, if he thought anybody was unfairly criticising him. That was the Alien Critic, an informal science fiction and fantasy journal. That was one of the convention booklets that have been Harlan Ellison. Although I think Harlan Ellison was actually, yes, he was a guest of honour at that one. So that's why I've got that. There'll be little bits and pieces about him inside there. That's another fanzine that will probably contain was Mondo Khan. He'll have been a guest of honour at that one, I'm guessing. Oh no, that was Hal Clement. So there must be a letter or something in there or something. Science fiction review, the Alien Critic. You know, the one I showed you earlier. It went on to become the Science Fiction Review. There'll be something there, Ellison on Ellison. So that one is another convention program book. I don't know if, guest of honour on Ellison, good looking chap. And, that's yeah, it's a critique on his Harlequin story. And then just got a bit more paraphernalia here. That's the English New Worlds magazine, to which Harlan Ellison contributed. Science Fiction Yearbook of Starlog. I'll have a piece in there. Crazy magazine. This was sort of like poor relation to Mad magazine, and there's something by Harlan in that one. I believe that was the first. Well, it's a bit messy, this one. It's got tape down it as well, but I wondered it because I think this was the very first publication of A Boy and His Dog, which they made a movie out of, by the way. You know, if anybody gets a chance to pick that one up. And then just a couple of large format science fiction magazines which contain Ellison stories. So right, there you have it. Yeah, so as I say, it's a slightly unusual edition of my collecting videos, but I felt duty bound to celebrate the man's work and his life in some way. And I thank you all very much for watching. And next time, I'm not sure, so you'll have to wait and find out. Okay, thanks everybody, and I will see you at a later date.